That's what it says. Okay, guys, are we back? Hello there. Anybody there? I thought I'm gonna be talking to myself again. All right, good. So a couple of you are back. Okay, let's take a look at small, weak, and micro states. Yeah. So if you look at, I mean, basically this is what was summarized from Alden, 44 to 45, basically. So how do we actually define minor or small powers? I mean, small, weak, and micro states. So basically, they're seen as minor or small powers. They are seen as, I mean, they're of course sovereign states, but they are not recognized as major or middle powers because they have small population, their resources are constrained, their physical size, the territory is also small. So that constrains their participation at the global level. Yeah, they are not able to make as much impact on the global level as, say, a major power, and maybe even and of course a micro middle power as well. Okay, so the funny thing is that you find that, when you look at small or minor powers, they are basically, they lump everything in there. Small, weak, micro states are all part of, this definition. So it's not a very clear definition. There's no clear characteristics. Similarly to the middle power states as well. But you will see that there is a distinction, right, being made between small powers or minor powers and weak states, right? So weak states will be the ones that are weak because they have underdeveloped economy or they are poor, right? The population is poor. Or it could be because they are given, they are conferred sovereignty, or there's external legitimacy because other states actually recognize their sovereignty, but the state is not able to control or ensure stability within the domestic borders, the national borders. So one of the things that we realize is that, when we talk about strong states, stable states, right, they will all be able to provide security, the basic services, right, the basic public goods and services, and they are able to protect the essential civil freedoms. But failed states do not actually fulfill any of these, right? So that's how we identify a failed states, right? They lack the institutions, they lack the internal coherence, they can't perform most of the basic state functions, to provide security, order, basic goods and services. Yeah, and weak states would usually be the ones that lack one or two of these functions. Okay. Okay, so let's take a look at, this is again Council on Foreign Relations, talking about weak states. What exactly is a weak state?
There is no generally accepted or formal definition of a weak state, but the core concept is a country that is either unwilling or unable to perform the basic functions and responsibilities of a state. Typically, they mean the ability to control the territory that the state occupies, its borders, to monopolize the legitimate use of force, essentially ensuring public security within that area, as well as providing basic services to the citizens. The basic sources of state weakness are the following. They're poor and underdeveloped. They often have weak political institutions. Probably the most important factor in terms of state weakness is whether the citizens of that country look upon the central government as a legitimate entity. When we look at weak states around the world today, predominantly they're in Africa and parts of the Middle East. The term weak state sort of entered into the lexicon right after the end of the Cold War, when we had a series of crises in the developing world. After 9/11, the concept of weak state became more prominent, mainly in the context of them becoming safe havens for terrorist organizations. And so you had this situation which is sort of unusual in international relations, in which instead of strong states being seen as the primary threat to national security, weak states became seen as the primary threat. There are many consequences of state weakness for their citizens. They often live in poverty, some are malnourished, infant mortality can be very high. In other weak states there may be endemic violence. In some cases the government is the threat to the citizens in the way they're repressive, or they can even conduct terrible genocide, as we saw in Rwanda. Well, the US is concerned about weak states for a variety of reasons. The first is the fear that weak states could be used as safe havens for terrorist organizations. A second concern is that states might descend into violent civil war. There is another dimension to state weakness that we worry about, and we see this in Pakistan. But this is a country that also has nuclear weapons. And here the primary concern is that the state might collapse and those weapons might fall into the hands of terrorist organizations that could use them against the United States. There are a variety of ways in which weak states can be helped. First and foremost is improving the economic conditions in the country. The second way is through political assistance. And this can be anything from helping them out with elections, to providing training for political officers, to training judges. The third way is to provide assistance to the security forces within that country. And if all this fails, and the situation really deteriorates and we're in a full-blown crisis, then we're talking about humanitarian assistance and ensuring that basic services can function in a crisis. As countries develop and become more modern, then this problem will hopefully recede. But a lot of states are still quite weak, and they still can pose a serious problem to international security as well as their citizens.
Okay, so that's the video on weak states. Yeah. I have another one next. This is Professor Wang Kang-Wu from NUS. Used to be with the East Asian Institute. Yeah. So this basically is a video where he discusses whether does small state mean that those states are weak. Yeah.
Smallness in itself doesn't mean weak. I'm very struck in history how many very small groups of people succeed in doing fantastic things. A small place like Switzerland, located very far away from places up in the mountains, it's already had a kind of security of its own, but maximizes its position and its resources, human resources in particular, arms itself very carefully, but carefully relating to all its neighbors in such a way that it has now survived for something like 700 or 800 years and still flourishing. And does it matter whether it is small or what the population is like? What matters was how it was organized, how united they were, how forcefully they project themselves as a unit that people must respect and admire. And they've succeeded extremely well. Take an example of the vast land empires that were built up by the Mongols. Genghis Khan's tribe was a very small tribe. Was there such a thing as a Mongol nation or Mongol state? Very hard to say. But he was able to create a sense of Mongol centrality, sense of unity and purpose, and then they set out to conquer the world. And my goodness, they nearly did. Manchu is another example. Small group of people in what is now Manchuria, about probably 1 million of them, but they were so united in purpose, so well organized and militarily capable of exerting so much force that they were able in the end to conquer the whole of China, which at that time probably had up to 300 million people. So in today's world, I think this principle still basically applies. If a country is united and the people are all clear about what they believe to be the important things for their country to survive, if they can share that and really work together to do that, I don't think anybody can touch them. And you arm yourself accordingly. You train yourself. You discipline yourself. You make all sorts of arrangements with your neighbors, with people far away. Relate yourself to all the powers, the international institutions, to make sure that you have maximum flexibility. And you're constantly looking out for opportunities, alert for possibilities, being very nimble, quick-footed, quick to respond. You can get a lot done and be very powerful and influential if you're able to do that.
Okay, so basically what he was mapping out there is really the recipe for being a strong, stable state. Yeah. Okay, this is actually an address by Lee Hsien Loong, right, about how small states can actually work together, right, basically to strengthen themselves, right, to strengthen their influence on the international arena, on the global stage.
Small states like Singapore can do little to influence the big powers, but we are not entirely without agency. There are many opportunities for small countries to work together to deepen economic cooperation, strengthen regional integration, and build up multilateral institutions. This way, we can strengthen our influence as a group and advance a collective position on issues that matter to us, be they trade, security, or technology. Our multilateral institutions today are far from perfect. The WTO is one of the major institutions in the post-war global order. But now it's almost paralyzed and urgently needs reform. Multilateral global deals like the Uruguay round are no longer practical when agreement requires a full consensus among 164 member countries of hugely diverse interests and philosophies. Furthermore, the WTO was designed for an agriculture and manufacturing-based world economy, but the world has moved on to services and now increasingly digital and intellectual property, which need much more complicated rules. The US has lost faith in the WTO. It often acts unilaterally, imposing tariffs and trade sanctions outside WTO rules. It prefers negotiating bilateral deals one-on-one against smaller countries in trials of strength. It gives more weight to the US's direct benefits in the disputes at hand than to its broader interests in upholding the multilateral system. And this has caused concern to many of the US's friends and allies. Singapore cannot afford to adopt the same point of view. Being small, we are naturally disadvantaged in bilateral negotiations. We need to reform and strengthen multilateral institutions, not cripple or block them. More fundamentally, confining ourselves to a bilateral approach means foregoing win-win opportunities which come from countries working together with more partners. And we need to build a broader regional and international architecture of cooperation. When groups of countries deepen their economic cooperation, they will enhance not just their shared prosperity, but also their collective security. And with more stake in one another's success, they'll have greater incentive to uphold a conducive and peaceful international order, which will benefit many countries, big and small.
Okay, so that gives you the perspective, right, from Singapore. So do you see Singapore as a small power? Yeah, small power, probably trying to pull together the small states, right, to work together so you can have a collective voice. Yeah. Okay, so these are some of the characteristics of small states. Now, if we look at small states, basically, um, I think this was the readings that you have, Casimirus as well as Veennendaal. Both of them actually said the same thing, almost the same thing, right? They said that basically small states are characterized by their military vulnerability, right? They don't have that the military clout, right? They lack natural and human resources, capital, and they have very limited domestic markets. So naturally, right, they will have to possibly be an export-oriented economy, and they also sometimes may be dependent on a single export commodity, right? Which means that um, if let's say the commodity has got, I mean the prices of a commodity is not as great, right? That would affect their economic growth. Yeah. So all these contribute to the small states' economic weakness and dependence on larger states. Okay, so I mean, if you look at all these characteristics, sounds very familiar, right? Sounds very much like Singapore. Yeah. Um, so these states are actually constrained, of course, right, because of their limited resources, limitations of their human resources, economic resources, military as well. They are constrained in what they can do in terms of foreign policy, right? There are certain diplomatic tools that they will not be able to um, use, right? For example, military, right? But they are not altogether powerless, right? That's one of the things that we need to remember, that even though you're small, right? Even though you're a small state, it does not necessarily mean that you're powerless. You cannot try to influence or to shape um, the external environment so that it is actually um, feasible um, to you, right? It's beneficial to you. So what we need to do is, when we're looking at the foreign policy of small states, in order to understand it a little bit better, we need to focus on what are some of the incentives and the motivations and the attitudes of the foreign policy decision makers. So like the foreign minister, the top leaders, right? And how they craft their foreign policy. So one of the things that you notice, right, is that small states are actually forced to seek alliances and coalitions. That's what we hear from Wang Kangwu as well as Lee Hsien Loong, right? We basically the modus operandi for small states is actually multilateralism. Yeah. Um, Veennendaal actually talks about this as in terms of international patron-client relationship. Yeah. So it is actually quite an interesting article that you should actually read. It's pretty easy to understand. Yeah. So here I just inserted the video on Nicaragua, right? As you know, Nicaragua at the end of last year, right, in December, it switched alliance to China from Taiwan. Right. So basically, it's ended its diplomatic ties with Taiwan. It's now basically recognized China. Yeah. Um, so this, you could see it as a reflection of what happens in a patron-client relationship.
China says that the Central American nation of Nicaragua has made the right choice after it cut ties with Taiwan in favor of Beijing. China insists that the move was not politically motivated. The break further shrinks Taiwan's dwindling pool of international allies. But the island says it is not phased. Victoria Jen has more.
China scored another diplomatic win over Taiwan after forming diplomatic relations with Nicaragua. Both sides signed a joint communique in the northern Chinese city of Tianjin as Nicaragua pledged its allegiance.
El gobierno de la República de Nicaragua declara que reconoce que en el mundo solo existe una sola China. La República Popular China es el único gobierno legítimo que representa a toda China y Taiwán es parte inalienable del territorio chino. El gobierno de la República de Nicaragua rompe a partir de hoy las relaciones diplomáticas con Taiwán y deja de tener cualquier contacto o relación oficial.
Taiwan has lost 8 allies to Beijing since President Tsai Ing-wen came to power in 2016. But in her response to the Central American country's decision to walk away, President Tsai Ing-wen appeared unfazed.
台湾的民主越成功，国际的支持越强，来自威权阵营的压力也会越大。但是我们都坚信，无论是外交施压或者是文攻武吓，都不会改变我们坚持民主自由、坚持走向世界、坚持参与国际民主社群的决心。
Nicaragua's move to cut ties with Taiwan coincided with the U.S. Summit for Democracy, in which the island was invited, and is widely seen as Beijing's retaliation against the U.S. and a warning for Taiwan after a video meeting with his Nicaraguan counterpart. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi told reporters Taiwan's remaining allies, now at 14, have stayed with Taipei only because of pressure from the United States and Taiwan's dollar diplomacy. Taiwan has hoped to cling on to its remaining allies with U.S. help. But ironically, Nicaragua's decision to ditch Taiwan for Beijing came after months of worsening ties with Washington. This after the Biden administration appeared to have successfully pressured Honduras from breaking ties with the island after the Central American nation elected a new president. Victoria Jen, CNA, Taipei.
Okay, so Veennendaal basically outlines the 4 characteristics of patron-client relationship. This should be quite familiar to you, right? Because you have actually talked about patronage and clientelism probably in your intro to PS, yeah? So basically there are 4 characteristics of this relationship, this kind of relationship. There must be this is an exchange relationship, but there is reciprocity. So it's an exchange relationship in the sense that one state gives another state some benefits. The other state gives, for example, the patron state gives the client state some benefits, economic resources or military backing and all that. And then the client state will then pledge allegiance or will support the patron state in any of its policies, right? In any of its international initiatives. Yeah. So it could be that they might basically vote along with the patron, right? In let's say a UN General Assembly vote, for example. Yeah. So there's reciprocity. Both sides will win. There's a win-win situation. But of course, right, it is it's very difficult to say that both sides actually win equally, right? But they both draw some benefits, some kind of benefits that they both desire. Okay. Then there's highly unequal, relationship between the two states, right, is necessarily asymmetric, necessarily unequal, because the patron state would be the more dominant state, right, having greater resources at hand compared to the client state, right. The client state is actually dependent on the benevolence of the patron state. Okay. Then you see that also the weaker or client state must also comply with the demands and interests of the patron or the major power. Otherwise, the patron would actually withdraw, right, its support for the client state. But and then the fourth one is that there must be some sort of affectivity that underlies the bond between the patron and the client. Mainly that there must be some sort of emotional sort of ties between the two, right? That generates loyalty, right? That allows the patron to claim, right, the client's loyalty to it. Yeah. And that loyalty helps to stabilize, right, that the linkage between the patron and client. Once that loyalty dissipates, right, that's where the linkage breaks. So that's what we saw in, for example, Nicaragua. You know, the patron was the U.S., right? They have actually a history of relationships between Nicaragua and the U.S., but it's been further strained, right? It's been strained over the last couple of years. Last year, especially, right? The U.S. has actually imposed sanctions on Nicaragua, which basically um, pushed it um, to basically Beijing side, right? To side with Beijing. Okay. So the basically because the client state or the weaker state is actually looking for protection and support from the larger state or the patron state, it is an exploitative relationship. So you'll find that basically the larger state, right, the patron, has a more powerful bargaining position. They can basically extract whatever they want, right? Whatever compensation that they want to demand, right, from the client, they can demand it in exchange for giving them the support that they want. So there are basically three types of benefits. What Veennendaal calls intangible benefits that the larger states actually want from the client state. So basically, he identified it as ideological convergence, international solidarity, and strategic advantage. So basically, this patron-client relationship can evolve if the weak state is willing and able to offer any combination of these above benefits that the large state seeks. Yeah. So initially, this was a very this analysis, right, of the dependence of the small state on the larger states in terms of patron-client relationship was rather popular in the 1980s, right? But with the end of the Cold War, right, some scholars actually thought that that would spell the end of this patron-client model, because initially it was, you have Russia and the U.S. both trying to basically create, right, their spheres of influence and trying to, basically um, enlarge their sphere of influence, take more and pull more states within their spheres of influence, and they do that using a patron-client kind of relationship. So some people thought that, well, with the collapse of the USSR, right, end of Cold War, this would spell the doom of the patron-client model, but it hasn't actually. And in fact, even the weak states are able to leverage this this support, right? Leverage the large states, because they are keenly aware, right, about um, what advantages they offer to these large states, right? How the large states actually seek, why the large state would actually seek their support. So it is you find that even today, right, the patron-client model is still very alive amongst the Caribbean, African, and the Pacific Islands, and this is especially played out in the China-Taiwan tensions. Yeah? And you also find that in terms of US, right? US also has quite a bit of influence, right, over and client states in the Caribbean and the Pacific. The most obvious one, which Veennendaal actually pointed out, was between US and Palau. He said that that was the most obvious and unconcealed patron-client relationship. Okay. All right, I have this. This is actually from December, talking about 12 states allied with Taiwan that basically were talking, right, and presenting and trying to persuade and influence the UN member states, right, to allow Taiwan to be included in the UN system. Okay. So this is what happens when you know, Taiwan does its dollar diplomacy, right? Has these allied states that recognize them. Um, in return, these allied states actually speak up for it in the UN system, UN General Assembly.
12 of Taiwan's allies have so far spoken out for Taiwan at this year's UN General Assembly session. On day 5 of the meeting on Saturday, St. Lucia, Eswatini, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Haiti, and Tuvalu all voiced their support for Taiwan's inclusion in the UN system. Taiwan's Central American ally, Nicaragua, is expected to add its support for Taiwan on the last day of the session on Monday. Worthy of mention is Japan, which has no official ties with Taiwan, talked about a geographical blank space as the world grapples with health issues. The blank space has largely been interpreted as a reference to Taiwan.
On day 5 of the 76th session of the UN General Assembly, countries that have official diplomatic ties with Taiwan continue to voice their support on the world stage.
Since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, Taiwan is in solidarity with the UN member states made a significant contribution in realizing the theme of this year's session. The Kingdom of Eswatini can attest to the fact that Taiwan is an indispensable partner and would, if given an opportunity, play a meaningful role in the global body.
It is a thriving democracy and it has a right to ask for meaningful inclusion in the relevant global institutions. New times demand fresh solutions, not old-fashioned hegemonic responses.
We continue to plead the case to advance their cause to be acceptable as a legitimate participant in the global decision-making process.
At the current session, 12 nations, including Palau and the Marshall Islands, have spoken out on behalf of Taiwan. 2 allies have been the exception, the Holy See and Honduras. The latter has refrained from doing so for the 6th consecutive year. However, Japan, which has no official diplomatic ties with Taiwan but is growing closer with Taiwan in recent years, did refer to Taiwan in a roundabout way.
This experience has taught us that there shouldn't be geographical blank space when we deal with issues at the WHA. What's important is that all countries and regions should be able to immediately and widely share relevant messages and knowledge in a free and transparent fashion.
The geographical blank space Suga referred to has largely been seen as an allusion to Taiwan, and his statement has been interpreted as a call for Taiwan's participation in the World Health Assembly in spite of Beijing's opposition.
Okay, so you see that Veennendaal actually talks about how patron expectations, right, of ideological convergence, international solidarity, and strategic advantage is translated into client behavior. And so basically, when you talk about ideological convergence, we see it as the client state actually reflects its allegiance to the superpower ideology, right? Or they may pay lip service to its key principles. So an example of this would be when US links aid to recipient states, right? They would expect them to, in you know, in to support, right, to respect ideals such as democracy and human rights. Right? So it's an expectations that's tied with the aid that they give to the recipient states. And then when it is international solidarity, right, what we saw was with that the 12 states that spoke up for um, Taiwan, right? It basically is it shows that the client states actually align itself, right? Aligns its foreign policy, voting behavior, its solidarity, right, with Taiwan, right, in an international organization like the UN. So, so the diplomatic struggle between China and Taiwan is actually a reflective of this particular benefit that the patron state wants. The patron state being Taiwan wants from its client states. Yeah, it wants them to show solidarity with them on the international stage. Then there's also strategic advantage, right? Which the patron state is looking for, right? Basically, what it what it means is that the client state actually allows the patron state to use their territory um, in in a manner that would strengthen its geostrategic position. So, for example, you see that in the U.S., right? The U.S. actually has quite a number of overseas military bases, and these military bases are uh, mostly found in their client states. Yeah. So, like for example, the former Pacific territories. Yeah. According to the pact that they have right between the U.S. and the Pacific territories, the U.S. actually has exclusive access to their territories to use their territories as a military base. So, but of course, what um, can also happen is that patron states can actually use these client states as their surrogate, right, to actually dabble in regional conflicts, or it could also use the client state as a venue for staging a revolution in neighboring countries. So that's actually the downside of that. No, the negative side of the patron-client relation between between the patron and client. Yeah. Okay, but the thing is that Veennendaal also pointed out that client states may not be all that powerless or weak. Yeah, because one of the things you will realize is that when there are a lot of states that actually they can appeal to as patrons, right? That actually strengthens their position. So it actually strengthens the client's position, right? Client state's position in terms of being able to bargain and to play off one patron against another, because it actually by having so many patrons, right, who will be willing to support or provide the necessary resources that the client state or the weaker state is seeking, right? The weaker state is sense of vulnerability and insecurity actually decreases. But and they can basically try to seek the best possible um, outcome for itself based on its own national interests by playing off these multiple patrons against each other. Or it could just basically, and then of course, it could threaten to seek protection from another patron unless this particular patron provides it with more resources that it's demanding for. Or the client state, the weaker state, could also decide to abandon the patron altogether, and basically become a member of a new bloc, so it has new allegiances. Yeah. And another thing that we noticed, or actually Veennendaal noticed, was that um, there could be what he called double clientelism. Double clientelism in the sense that international clientelism, right, combines with the clientelism that's taking place in the domestic arena, in national politics, for example. So this actually, what it does is that the political leader that is able to draw in resources from the patron state, right, will basically use those resources to shore up his political position, right, and to distribute some of that spoils to his own clients so that he can basically more or less buy loyalty as well amongst his clients. So, of course, that assumes that there is a steady stream of funding and payoffs and stuff like that from the international patron. Yeah. Yeah. So but that also means that the state is also, it adds the dimension of political dependency on top of military and economic dependency, because in terms of international patron client, right? Usually, you find that small states actually seek a patron state for economic purposes, right? Because they are economically dependent, right, on that large state, or because they don't have enough resources to actually um, build its own military. So it's dependent on the large state for its military security, for example. But when there's the funding or resources that come from international patrons are actually redirected to shore up his domestic patron client networks, that adds the additional dimension of political dependency. Okay, but there have been also criticisms of this, what we call the international patron-client relationship or international clientelism, right? One of the things that, of course, the idealists, right, would say that it basically runs counter to our notions of state sovereignty and independence, because you're making a weak state even more dependent, right? And as a result, it is a vassal state, right? It's not an independent sovereign state. You know? And also it undermines the notion that the public opinion or the citizens actually have input into the state's foreign policy, because most of our foreign policy is actually dictated to it by its patron state. Yeah? Um, and then, of course, those who see these small states that are very visibly um, dependent on their patron, right, and act according to their patron. Um, most other states may actually label it as a political opportunism. These states are political opportunists. But Veennendaal actually notes that um, you should actually you know, look upon this patron-client link as a modus operandi of small states, because it is crucial, right, for their own existence, right, to ensure that their continued existence, for their continued survival as independent states, um, especially in a world that's dominated by larger states. These small states have no choice, right, but to establish these kinds of links with larger states. And in fact, basically, Veennendaal also said that patron states should be under as much criticisms as their client states. That you shouldn't just vilify the client states for as political opportunists, but also you know basically acknowledge that the patron state is actually um, a party to this, as much a party to this as the client state. Okay, then there are emerging powers. Yeah. So Alden basically looks at emerging powers as a group of states that is able to challenge the dominance of Western powers, because they do have the combination of economic prowess, diplomatic acumen, and military might. So basically, he names China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran um, as basically you know, amongst the emerging powers that basically they are Now, of course, you know that they are actually seeking support, right, for a coalition of group of friends in defense of the UN Charter. So they are basically pushing back, right, against the use of threat or force and unilateral sanctions. So they are basically challenging I mean, if you want to look at a group of states that are challenging, right, the dominance of Western powers, then you could actually look at what the group of friends in defense of the UN Charter is trying to do, right, in terms of pushing back on um, the on what the UN powers, what the Western powers are trying to do in the UN. And then you will also see that most of these emerging powers will translate their economic standing into foreign policy gains in the international arena. So, for example, China, right, basically translating its economic growth and economic resources into dollar diplomacy. It's also trying to gain friends along the BRI, right? So you find that usually emerging powers are those that would have moved out of their region, right? So like China, India, Brazil, right? They have actually moved out of their home region, right? Their immediate region, right? To other regions like the African continent, which is traditionally dominated by the Western powers like US and certain European countries. So why are they doing that? Part of the reason is because they are aiming to gain access to Africa's resources. Africa has a lot of natural resources, minerals, oil, etc. So that's what they after gold as well. And then, of course, there's also the rhetoric of, they always use the rhetoric of South-Solidarity because they see themselves as part of the South, right? The initially less developed countries that have actually made good, right? Um, and and they are there to help these southern less developed countries, and they know their struggles, right? They basically are able to form a common bond with these African countries. So quite a number of them, of course, have extended developmental assistance and aid to Africa, and over the years, of course, China has been quite active, right, in trying to strengthen this South-South cooperation, especially through its BRI. But of course, that's been criticized by the Western powers as a debt trap for these states. Okay, I thought I'll just end with something that is quite fun. All right, China's Panda Diplomacy.
This is Bao Bao. She was born in 2013 at the National Zoo in Washington, D.C. Here she is biting her foot. Here she is in the snow. And here she is in a jumbo-sized FedEx crate bound for a one-way trip to Chengdu, China. Bao Bao left because she was never ours to keep. Her parents Mei Sheng and Tian Tian came from China 17 years ago, but they weren't a gift, they were a loan. And that loan stipulated their offspring will also belong to China, as do almost all of the pandas in zoos worldwide. Pandas' natural habitat exists entirely within the borders of one country, and that means these animals are more than just mascots for China. They're also tools in China's global diplomatic strategy.
What China figured out as it kind of became more of an international power in the second half of the 20th century was that this was something it could use to its advantage.
Pandas have been part of Chinese foreign policy since at least the 1950s.
Initially, it was just kind of given in the same way that, governments have usually given exotic animals to others. It gave pandas to its allies. Then, after pandas officially became endangered, and that looked kind of tacky, they started giving pandas as loans.
In return, the receiving zoos pay $1 million per panda each year in fees. And if a cub is born, zoos pay an extra cub tax of $400,000.
The thing is that China doesn't give pandas to any country that can put up the money for a loan. It's much more selective than that.
Researchers at the University of Oxford have noticed a correlation between panda loans and China's international trade deals.
So in 2010, China realized that it needed to find more market capacity to buy salmon. Their traditional trade partner, who was Norway, had been the Nobel Peace Prize had gone to a Chinese dissident. China didn't feel like rewarding that behavior, so instead they turned to Scotland, which also produced salmon, also produced Land Rovers, which was something else that the Chinese affluent class were interested in. And so they inked that trade deal, and a panda was sent to the Edinburgh Zoo.
But what China gives, it can also take away. Consider the case of Taishan, Bao Bao's older brother from DC.
China had made it known toward the end of 2009 that it wanted to take back the panda Taishan. It hadn't really set a date yet.
Officials at the National Zoo asked China to extend his stay, but the answer was no. Experts suspect a couple of factors were involved in that choice.
One, President Obama met with the Dalai Lama, who is a strong critic of the Chinese government and a fierce advocate for the independence of Tibet, which the Chinese government denies.
And second, the U.S. announced an arms sale to Taiwan over Chinese objections. A week later, Taishan and another panda from the Atlanta Zoo were on their way to China.
It considers pandas as kind of another arm of diplomacy, in the same way that in the event of a diplomatic spat, one country might recall its ambassador or might impose economic sanctions. China sees, or certainly appears to see from the way that its agreements go, pandas as kind of a way to reinforce international relationships that it's building and that it wants to continue.
More recently, we saw China delay a panda delivery following the disappearance of a Malaysia Airlines plane carrying 152 Chinese nationals.
In 2014, Malaysia was all ready to get its first panda. They had the enclosure ready at the zoo and all of that. And the day of the panda's supposed arrival came and went because the Chinese government was extremely frustrated with the Malaysian government's investigation of the flight, didn't feel that it was doing enough, and so kept the pandas for another month or two as a way to demonstrate to the Malaysian government that, yeah, you know, we've signed a regional trade deal with you, we're interested in pursuing a relationship, but you're not making us super happy right now.
Currently, the U.S. still has 12 pandas, including Bao Bao's new little brother, Bei. But future relations with China could change that.
It's entirely possible that whether in a military respect in the South China Sea or in a political respect with regards to Taiwan, that China will find good reason to feel that the U.S. is no longer interested in pursuing the kind of warm partnership that they've had. So what that means for panda diplomacy is really anyone's guess.
Okay, hope that was a fun segue. Did you all know anything about panda diplomacy? How much it costs? No reaction. Okay, never mind. Okay, so let's take a look at... Never knew we had to pay to get the pandas. Yeah, $1 million a year, no? That's quite a bit, right? Now we've got Lele. Lele is going back in 2 years, right? Yeah. But Lele is going back, I think, in 2 years' time, right? That's what they said. So that's quite a bit of money, eh? Okay, so let's take a look at the world of states. So if you look at the world of states, right, we have actually evolved quite a bit. Yeah, there's been a surge in the states in the 1960s with decolonization, right? But that was balanced by the stabilizing force of the Cold War. And so basically, because of the Cold War, the two superpowers, the USSR and the US, basically created spheres of influence, which basically dampened the instabilities that could have been brought about by the surge in the independent states in the 1960s, right? Those that were former colonies. Okay, but and then if you look at recent global developments, it seems to suggest, right, that we are actually moving beyond the traditional assumption of world of states. Because if we look at it, again, we have an increase in the number of states, but that's also due to the sudden increase of fragile states in the 1990s, right? The breakout of the USSR, etc., and then the breakout of USSR, etc. And then we had a lot of uh, states falling apart, right? And that resulted in international and regional instability. And then, of course, we also see that there were also an increase in there was increase in subnational challenges to the state, either because they were threatening to secede, or it was the result of Cold War. Sorry, not Cold War, the Civil War, right? So you see that in Chechnya, Russia. You see that in Sudan, right? North versus South Sudan. You see that in East Timor, right? Timor-Leste within Indonesia, Bosnia, etc. And then, of course, there were also peaceful movements, right, that led to further regionalism and federalism. But um, then we also see that with greater globalization, right, accelerated pace of globalization, that has also led to further interdependency, right, and further development of political and economic networks. So we find that the state itself is no longer impervious, right, and no longer omnipotent, right? And also you find that a lot more TNCs, right, were starting to actually influence the political and economic networks, and they were actually a force to be reckoned with by themselves. So, but of course, and then of course we also see a rise in non-state actors in the form of international organizations as well. As we became more interdependent as a world, right? You had to have this middleman, the international organization, set up to try um, to coordinate, right, the interactions between states. But what some scholars noted was that even though all these different processes, right, have been substantial, right, and seems to indicate that we are actually moving, or we can no longer talk about ourselves as a world of states, but maybe moving towards a global village or whatever. But there's an incomplete transformation. Because it's not equal across all states. Right? We are not seeing it um, happening at the same pace across all states, and so um, we find that uh, the world has not actually transformed much. Right? Even though we have very optimistic people talking about how we're becoming a global village, that hasn't really happened. So the state is still key. So the institution of the state is still central in the ordering of international life, and we find that the state as a political organization is better organized on the whole to achieve the sorts of objectives that citizens want, right? Which is security, order, prosperity, development. So national governments also still are very key players in designing, managing, and controlling their foreign relations. Um, and so you find that foreign policies of the state still enjoy an influence that um, privileges the state above non-state actors. Okay, so these are here. The next slide is actually some exam questions from Block 7. If you look at Block 7, right, some of the exam questions are quite different from, I mean, they talk about history, right, which Alden doesn't actually cover in his subject guide. And even when you look at the learning outcomes, right, for this block. It doesn't actually talk about, it doesn't really talk about the history as well. But I mean, if you read through some of the case studies that I put up, right, on the Gulf states, on um, yeah, on the Middle East, on Africa, etc. Those I mean, once you read through, right, you'll be able to get a sense of how history actually comes into play, in a state's foreign policy. Okay, if you were to look at these questions, do you think you'll be able to answer these questions? Do you think you'll be comfortable answering these questions? Wow, really? Okay, good. Yipeng and Wenyi is pretty good. The first four are okay. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, I think the first four should be okay. It's the fifth one that's a little bit iffy. Yeah. I was actually going to try and look at and see if I can find any readings that address this, but yeah, but I haven't had time to look for it. Yeah, but anyway, I'll try and see if I can find any readings that uh, basically you can refer to, or you can read very quickly to get a sense of how to answer this question. Okay. Decolonization and how it's born weak states. Yeah, that's a good idea. And then how weak states, yeah, the client-patron relationship. Yeah, that's a good idea. It could also um, indicate, right? History could also indicate that you would have certain states that you see as allies, certain states that you see as enemies, and of course you will be more allied to um, the states that you're friendly with, right? So you will probably be more suspicious of the hostile states. So that would also indicate, right? Would also shape how you approach these different states in terms of your foreign policy as well, and um, what sort of diplomatic tools you use, right? What sort of tools you use in your foreign policy, right? So, I mean, if you think about, say, for example, U.S. against China, U.S. and China relationship, or U.S. and no, U.S. foreign policy towards China, U.S. foreign policy towards Russia, U.S. foreign policy towards UK, pretty different, right? Yeah. So it could be a history of good relationships between them that causes them to have to have a lot more closer ties and arrangements and all that. You didn't think of that. Yeah, but I mean that is also another point that you can bring into that into the mix, into the answer for that question. Okay, so I mean I think if you look at block 7, the questions, right, they seem to be quite not that many coming out of block 7. Okay, so these are the references for today. So if you want to go and read them, right, these are basically the readings that I used for today's deck of slides. I'll have to update the reading syllabus so that you'll get the latest. But Veennendaal is the one, right? The last one is the one that I use for discussing the patron-client relationship. Yeah. And next week, I haven't really looked at all the readings for external environment, but we'll probably, if you can, right, just read through Olden. I think it's very thin, right? Very short. Probably just give you a very brief overview of, the impact of external environment on foreign policy. Okay, so these are probably the readings that I'll use for next week's deck of slides. Yeah. Okay, I don't know, just in case you guys still don't know where to find stuff. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to go back to this again, right? Just to remind you that, there's something that in the folders that you need to look for, but I think I shall be nice and show you where it is. I believe it's here, and I believe it's here. Okay. I hope this is not the first time that you're looking at this, yeah. So I've organized the questions from 2012, right, all the way to 2021, right. All these are all the questions for Zone A and Zone B, and I've color-coded them according to the blocks. Okay, so as you can tell, it took a long time to actually go through every single question. So please make full use of this. Yeah. So yeah, if you let me see. Yeah, if you look at one second. You guys didn't see it. Alamak, I have to show you. Okay, so it's 2012A, B, right, all the way to 2021, A, B. Yeah, you see that 2020, there's only one, right? Because I think both Zone A and Zone B did the same questions. Okay, so I've actually organized it in terms of, I've color coded it in terms of blocks. Okay, so this is the color code for you. I have split block, for block 6, right? I've split it into two, right? It's because one is actually on regime type, the other one is on media and public opinion. Yeah, I mean, it's quite obviously split, so that's why I split it that way. Okay, so you'll find that, okay, so this is basically, I've organized them in terms of your blocks. Again, you'll see that, this is block 7, today's one, right? So, yeah, you see that basically the very, 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 very popular one is from block 6. Okay. And there's really not much in terms of FPA overview. Yeah. And then I also put the zone Bs together. So this is actually thematic classes, zone A, zone B. Yeah. So it's block 1 all the way down to block 10, block 11, sorry. Yeah. And then zone B, block 1 all the way down to block 11. Yeah, so this actually shows you the zone B questions. Okay, so you'll see that this is basically block 7, right? It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 questions so far. And it's only been, it's mostly, it doesn't come out every year. Okay, so this is how you, I mean, if you want to take a look at it, this is how you might want to use this. I have also, in this case, I've color coded with the fonts, right? I've changed the font colors because just to indicate to you that this is actually a combination of blocks. Yeah, it's not just block 5 alone, right? But it actually combines other um, other concepts in there, not just block 5 concepts, but other concepts from other blocks. You're welcome. Some questions asking about geography. Yes, how geography affects countries' foreign policy. Just curious which block I put it under. I think, hang on a second now, I remember that, let me see, geography. I put it under 8, role of external environment. Okay, geography, technology. Because it's more, I mean, I would consider it as a external environment thingy. No, we haven't. Not yet. I don't know whether we are gonna. I mean, I'm gonna have to take a look and see the readings and see if I can find it in the readings or not. But I mean, sometimes I don't know. I've been looking at some of the Alden stuff. Right, he doesn't really cover the things that he asks in your question. So I'm also puzzled. I mean, I'm trying to pull out, going through other stuff and see if I can pull it out somewhere. Yeah. So please make good use of it, right? I mean, like I said, I can just help you by helping you to organize this in terms of clusters, thematic clusters, blocks, etc. But it's really up to you to figure out how to study for the exam and how to answer your questions. Okay. You realize that from I think it's a 2016 onwards, they actually gave you more questions. They give you 10 questions in your exams, where you can choose 3 out of 10. Prior to 2016, you only had 8 questions. So that's why these are blank. All right. So these are your multicolored ribbons that you guys didn't look for. Did any of you go look for it? Or is this the first time you're seeing it? You did. Okay, good. Yeah. So this is one thing that I do for the classes that I teach, because I think it's easier for. I mean, it will help you all to organize your revision a little bit better. Do you know when your prelims are? And are they actually holding a prelims? And are you all actually intending to do your prelims? Yes, no, maybe? Okay, so Ipan is gonna take a prelims. Any idea when is it? No news yet. Okay. So you don't know whether they are really holding a prelims for you guys or not? Because I know that I think last year SIR there was no prelims for the school. I mean from UOL. I have no idea why. Okay, you haven't heard anything. I think it's usually end Feb, right? Yeah. Okay. All right. I think it's usually, I mean, I don't know, as far as I remember, it's usually end Feb, but I'm not sure if they are holding prelims for every single course, because last year they didn't. So that's why I was wondering if they are doing it for all the courses or not. Okay. Keep you guys in suspense, right? They'll probably give you one month to study for it. Hmm. Okay, I guess that's it for today. I hope, please go back and just look through the other readings, because I didn't have time. I think I'm going to try and speed up. I mean, this one I didn't really want to spend too much time on it, because I think, I mean, looking at the exam questions, it doesn't really come out all the time. Yeah, so that's why I'm just giving you a very broad overview, right, of the the things that are necessary to understand the learning outcomes, to be able to answer the learning outcomes, yeah, to achieve the learning outcomes rather. Okay, so I'll see you guys next week. You guys have a good week, end of the week, end to the week rather, and good weekend. Yeah. You're welcome. Thank you all for coming. Keep safe, keep healthy, stay home. Yeah. And don't go to Clarke Quay, yeah. Any of you were at Clarke Quay? You're welcome. You guys take care too. Yeah.